At 30,000 feet above the ground, I learned that some people's prejudices can fly just as high as any airplane. But what they didn't know was that my dignity could soar even higher. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Dr. Maya Johnson, and I've spent the last 8 years working as a child psychologist in Denver, Colorado. Every morning when I wake up in my modest 2-bedroom apartment overlooking the Front Range, I feel grateful for the path that brought me here. The journey wasn't easy, but it shaped me into the woman I am today, someone who understands resilience not just as a concept I teach, but as a lived experience. I love my work deeply. There's something profoundly moving about helping families navigate the complex world of childhood development and mental health. Each day brings new challenges, new breakthroughs, and new reminders of why I chose this profession. It's rewarding in ways that go beyond any paycheck, challenging in ways that keep me growing, and has taught me more about human nature than any textbook, lecture, or graduate course ever could. My practice serves children from all backgrounds and all walks of life. In my office, I've worked with kids whose parents are CEOs and kids whose parents work 3 jobs just to make ends meet. I've helped children process divorce, trauma, learning disabilities, social anxiety, and family loss. What I've learned over the years is that pain doesn't discriminate, and neither should healing. I'm a Black woman in America, and while I've certainly faced my share of challenges throughout my life, I've been fortunate to build a career filled with purpose and professional respect. My colleagues value my expertise and often seek my input on difficult cases. My patients' families trust me with their most precious concerns and intimate family struggles. I've worked incredibly hard to create a practice that serves children from all backgrounds, and I take pride in the reputation I've built in the Denver mental health community. Growing up in Atlanta, I was raised by my grandmother after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. Grandma Rose was a retired school teacher who believed that education was the great equalizer and that dignity was something you carried within yourself, not something others could grant or take away. She used to tell me, "Maya, baby, you can't control what people think about you, but you can always control how you respond to their thinking. That's where your power lives." Those words carried me through high school, through my undergraduate years at Spelman College, through the rigorous demands of graduate school in clinical psychology, through my internship years, and through the challenges of building my own practice. Every obstacle I encountered, every moment when someone questioned my capabilities or my right to be in certain spaces, I heard Grandma Rose's voice reminding me where my true power resided. That Tuesday morning in March started like any other. The spring air in Denver carried that crisp promise of warmer days ahead, and I was excited about the day's plans. I was heading to Seattle for a 3-day conference on childhood trauma, an event I'd been looking forward to for months. The conference featured some of the leading researchers in my field, workshops on innovative therapeutic techniques, and opportunities to network with other professionals who shared my passion for helping children heal and grow. I had spent weeks preparing for this trip. My presentation on cultural competency in child therapy was scheduled for the second day, and I was both nervous and excited to share my research with colleagues from around the country. The paper I'd be presenting represented 2 years of work, examining how therapeutic approaches needed to be adapted to serve children from diverse cultural backgrounds effectively. My morning routine that day was the same as always. I woke up at 5:30, spent 20 minutes in meditation and prayer, then had my usual breakfast of oatmeal with fresh berries while reviewing my presentation notes one final time. I had packed my bags the night before, double-checking that I had everything I needed: my conference materials, business cards, the handouts for my presentation, and my lucky fountain pen that had been with me since graduate school. I arrived at Denver International Airport 2 hours early as I always do. Flying makes me slightly nervous, not because of the mechanics of flight, but because airports and airplanes can be such intimate spaces where you're forced to interact with strangers in close quarters for extended periods. You never know what kind of energy people will bring to that shared space, what moods they're carrying, what assumptions they might make, or how they might treat fellow travelers. The airport was bustling that morning with the typical mix of business travelers, families heading on vacation, and the occasional nervous first-time flyer. I made my way through security without incident, grabbed a coffee from my favorite vendor, and settled into a quiet corner near my gate to review my notes one last time. I always find that the nervous energy before a flight is perfect for final preparation work. I was dressed professionally that day, a navy blazer that had been tailored to fit me perfectly, a crisp white blouse that I'd pressed that morning, and comfortable but polished flats that would serve me well during the long conference days ahead. My hair was pulled back in a neat bun that struck the right balance between professional and approachable. I carried my leather briefcase, a graduation gift from Grandma Rose, containing my conference materials, laptop, and the various tools of my trade. Looking back, I realize I looked exactly like what I was. A professional woman traveling for work, someone with education, expertise, and purpose. But I've learned over the years that how I see myself and how others see me aren't always the same thing. The flight was nearly full, which meant I'd be sharing my row with strangers for the 2.5-hour journey to Seattle. I'd booked an aisle seat in economy class. My small practice doesn't quite afford business class yet, but it's a goal I'm working toward as my client base grows. As I made my way down the narrow aisle, checking seat numbers against my boarding pass, I felt that familiar mix of anticipation and travel anxiety that always accompanies flying. I found my row and began the careful dance of settling in for the flight. I placed my carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, being mindful not to crowd other passengers' belongings. I organized my seat space efficiently, keeping my briefcase under the seat in front of me, pulling out my book, water bottle, and phone for easy access during the flight. A few minutes later, as I was arranging my things and getting comfortable, a white woman in her 50s approached my row, moving slowly down the aisle while checking her boarding pass against the seat numbers above each row. She had that polished, expensive look that comes from years of financial comfort. A designer handbag that I recognized from magazine advertisements, jewelry that caught the cabin lighting just so, and clothes that whispered rather than shouted their quality and cost. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who was accustomed to a certain level of comfort, respect, and deference from others. Her posture, her expression, the way she moved through the cabin, it all spoke of someone who rarely had her assumptions challenged or her expectations unmet. "Excuse me," she said as she reached my row, her voice carrying that particular tone I'd learned to recognize over the years, not quite rude enough to be called outright disrespectful, but not quite respectful enough to be considered truly polite either. It was that carefully modulated tone that many people use when they want to maintain plausible deniability about their intentions while still communicating their true feelings. I looked up from my book with a smile ready on my face, prepared to be helpful in whatever way I could. After all, travel can be confusing and we're all just trying to get where we need to go. "Yes? How can I help you?" "I think you might be in the wrong seat," she said, her eyes scanning me from head to toe in a way that felt more like an evaluation than simple observation. I felt a small flutter of uncertainty. Had I misread my boarding pass? It wouldn't be the first time someone had made that kind of mistake. "Oh, I don't think so, but let me double-check to be sure." I pulled out my boarding pass and looked at it carefully. "Seat 14C, that's me." She frowned, looking at her own boarding pass with exaggerated concentration. "But I'm 14B in the middle seat. Are you sure you're supposed to be in this section? I mean, are you sure this is your correct seat assignment?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire you can't quite locate. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that comes when you realize someone is questioning your right to occupy a space not because of facts or evidence, but because of assumptions they've made about who you are and what you deserve. "Yes, I'm quite sure," I said calmly, holding up my boarding pass so she could see it clearly. "This is my assigned seat. I'm in 14C, the aisle seat." She studied my boarding pass longer than was necessary, as if the letters and numbers might rearrange themselves under her scrutiny to prove her initial assumption correct. Her examination felt performative, designed more to make a point than to gather information. I assumed." She trailed off, but her meaning was crystal clear to anyone who had lived in my skin for 34 years. She had assumed that someone who looked like me wouldn't be sitting in the same section as someone who looked like her. As she squeezed past me to reach the middle seat, I caught her muttering under her breath to her companion, a man roughly her age who I assumed was her husband, something about the quality of passengers these days, and how you never know who you'll end up sitting next to anymore. The words stung, not because they were particularly creative or cutting, but because they represented a mindset I'd encountered countless times throughout my life. The idea that my presence somehow diminished the quality of a space simply by virtue of my being there was a familiar pain, but that didn't make it any less sharp when it cut. I opened my book, a clinical text on developmental psychology that I was rereading in preparation for my presentation, and tried to focus on the words on the page. But I found myself hyper-aware of every gesture, every glance, every subtle signal from the woman beside me. It's exhausting, that level of vigilance, but it's a survival skill that many people like me develop early in life. The subtle microaggressions continued as we prepared for takeoff. When the flight attendant came by offering pre-flight beverages, the woman made a point of declining and then pulling out antibacterial wipes to clean her armrest, tray table, and seat belt buckle. She performed this cleaning ritual with theatrical precision, making sure I could see every swipe of the sanitizing cloth. The message was clear. My proximity had somehow contaminated her space, and she needed to cleanse herself of whatever invisible residue my presence had left behind. It was the kind of behavior that's difficult to call out directly because it maintains just enough plausible deniability. After all, who could argue against someone wanting to maintain good hygiene while traveling? As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, I tried to lose myself in my book. The chapter 1 was reading discussed the long-term psychological effects of discrimination on children, particularly how repeated exposure to bias and prejudice could shape a child's developing sense of self-worth. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was reading about these very dynamics while experiencing them firsthand. During the safety demonstration, I noticed the woman glancing at me repeatedly, as if trying to solve some puzzle that my presence represented. When I pulled out my phone to switch it to airplane mode, she leaned away from me slightly, as if I might be planning to use my device for some nefarious purpose. About 30 minutes into the flight, after we'd reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign had been turned off, I received a phone call that I needed to take before switching my phone to airplane mode. It was from Dr. Patricia Williams, the mother of one of my young patients, and she sounded distressed. "Dr. Johnson, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I'm really worried about Marcus. He's been having those nightmares again, and last night he told me he doesn't want to go to school anymore because the other kids make fun of how he talks." Marcus was a 7-year-old boy I'd been working with for several months. He had a slight speech impediment that made him self-conscious, and we'd been making excellent progress in building his confidence and developing coping strategies for social situations. "I understand your concern, Dr. Williams," I said quietly, mindful of the other passengers around me. "The nightmares can be really scary for both Marcus and for you as his mother. Let's schedule a session for early next week so we can address this regression and work on some new strategies together." I spoke in the calm, professional tone I always used with parents, offering reassurance while also taking their concerns seriously. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes, just long enough to provide some immediate support and schedule appropriate follow-up care. After I hung up and switched my phone to airplane mode, the woman turned to her husband and said, loudly enough for me and several other passengers to hear, "Can you believe some people conduct their personal business so publicly? No sense of propriety or consideration for others." The comment hit me like a slap. I wanted to explain that it wasn't personal business. It was a mother reaching out to a mental health professional about her child's well-being. I wanted to tell her about the years of education I'd pursued, the licensing examinations I'd passed, the hundreds of families I'd helped navigate difficult times. I wanted her to understand that taking that call wasn't inconsiderate. It was exactly what a responsible healthcare provider should do when a parent reaches out in distress. But I knew from experience that explanations wouldn't change what she'd already decided about me. Her mind was made up before I'd even boarded the plane, and no amount of evidence to the contrary would alter her predetermined conclusions. Instead, I took a deep breath and reminded myself of Grandma Rose's words, "Maya, you can't control what people think about you, but you can control how you respond to their thinking." As the plane continued its journey westward, cruising over the majestic peaks of the Rocky Mountains and then the high plains beyond, I found myself slipping into a reflective state that had become familiar over the years. This wasn't my first encounter with this particular dance of discrimination, and I knew it wouldn't be my last. What struck me most wasn't the overt nature of the bias. There were no slurs used, no explicitly racist language, no whites-only signs posted anywhere. This was the modern, evolved version of discrimination. Assumptions wrapped in politeness, prejudice disguised as concern, and the constant questioning of my right to occupy the same spaces as everyone else. It was the kind of discrimination that people could engage in while still thinking of themselves as good, tolerant people. After all, she hadn't said anything explicitly racist. She had just assumed I was in the wrong place, questioned my presence, made comments about hygiene and propriety. All perfectly deniable, all wrapped in just enough ambiguity to make challenging it seem like an overreaction. But I knew better. I'd been navigating these waters my entire adult life. I thought about my patients, children of all colors and backgrounds who came to my office carrying their own wounds, their own experiences of being judged, excluded, marginalized, or diminished because of who they were or where they came from. I thought about the conversations I regularly had with their parents about building resilience, about teaching kids to hold on to their sense of worth even when the world seemed determined to chip away at it piece by piece. Here I was, 34 years old with a doctoral degree and a successful practice, living those very lessons at 30,000 feet above the ground. I pulled out my journal, a habit I'd maintained since my graduate school days, and began writing. Not about the woman beside me or her assumptions, but about resilience. About the crucial difference between reacting and responding. About how dignity isn't something someone can take from you, it's something you carry within yourself regardless of external circumstances. I wrote about the children I worked with who showed remarkable strength in the face of adversity. Kids like 8-year-old Aaliyah, who had been bullied at school for her accent but who had learned to speak up for herself with grace and confidence. Like 10-year-old David, who had been teased for his learning differences but who had discovered his talents in art and music. Like 12-year-old Sophia, who had experienced discrimination because of her family's immigration status but who had learned to take pride in her bilingual abilities and multicultural identity. These children were my teachers as much as I was theirs. They showed me daily what resilience looked like, what dignity in action meant, what it took to maintain your sense of self when others tried to diminish you. As I wrote, I became aware that the woman beside me was occasionally glancing over at my journal, trying to read what I was writing. I adjusted my position slightly to maintain my privacy, but I found myself wondering what she might think if she could see the words flowing from my pen. Would she be surprised to learn that I was reflecting on resilience and human dignity rather than plotting some kind of revenge for her treatment of me? The flight attendants began their beverage service, and when they reached our row, I ordered a ginger ale. The woman beside me made a comment to her husband about how some people weren't concerned about their sugar intake and the health implications of drinking soda. It was such a petty, unnecessary comment that I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Here was a grown woman, probably in her 50s, making judgmental comments about a stranger's beverage choice as if it had any bearing on anything meaningful. The pettiness of it was almost more insulting than the racial assumptions because it revealed such a small-minded approach to interacting with the world. When I pulled out my laptop to review my conference presentation one more time, she leaned away from me dramatically, as if my computer might somehow contaminate her or as if I might be engaged in some suspicious activity. The performance was so obvious that even her husband seemed embarrassed by her behavior. I opened the PowerPoint presentation I'd spent months perfecting, titled, Cultural Competency in Child Therapy, Building Bridges Across Difference. The irony of working on a presentation about bridging cultural divides while sitting next to someone who seemed determined to maintain those very divides wasn't lost on me. My presentation explored how mental health professionals could better serve children from diverse backgrounds by understanding the role that culture, identity, and social context play in psychological development. It discussed the importance of recognizing our own biases and assumptions, and how those unconscious prejudices could interfere with our ability to provide effective care. As I reviewed my slides, I found myself thinking about how the woman beside me might benefit from some of these concepts. Her assumptions about me were probably unconscious, rooted in stereotypes and biases that she'd never taken the time to examine or challenge. She likely didn't think of herself as a racist person, and she probably would have been genuinely offended if someone had suggested that her behavior demonstrated racial bias. But that's exactly what made this kind of discrimination so insidious and so persistent. It operated below the level of conscious awareness, manifesting in subtle behaviors and assumptions that accumulated over time to create a hostile environment for people like me. About an hour and 15 minutes into the flight, just as I was getting deeply absorbed in my presentation review, there was a sudden commotion several rows ahead of us. A young boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, had started crying loudly. But this wasn't the typical crying of a child who was tired or bored. This was the sound of genuine distress. "I can't breathe. I can't breathe," the boy was saying between sobs. "Something's wrong. Something's wrong with me." His mother's voice rose above his cries, filled with panic. "Tommy, sweetie, what's wrong? Talk to mommy. What hurts?" I could see from my aisle seat that the little boy was hyperventilating, his small chest rising and falling rapidly as he struggled to catch his breath. His face was flushed, and his eyes had that wide, terrified look that I'd seen too many times in my practice, the look of a child experiencing a full-blown panic attack. The mother was doing her best to comfort him, but her own panic was clearly making the situation worse. "Should I call for a doctor? Is there a doctor on the plane?" she called out desperately. The flight attendants rushed to the scene, but they were obviously out of their depth. They knew basic first aid and emergency procedures, but they weren't trained to handle pediatric mental health crises. One of them was trying to speak calmly to the boy while another was consulting with the lead flight attendant about whether they needed to divert the plane for a medical emergency. I watched this scene unfold for maybe 30 seconds, feeling the familiar pull of professional responsibility. This wasn't about race or assumptions or microaggressions. This was about a child in acute distress, and I had skills and training that could potentially help. But I hesitated for a moment, acutely aware of how my offer to help might be received. Would the mother trust me? Would the flight attendants take me seriously? Would other passengers question my qualifications because of their assumptions about who I was? Then I heard Grandma Rose's voice in my head as clear as if she were sitting beside me. Maya, baby, when someone needs help and you have the ability to provide it, you don't worry about what people think. You just help. I closed my laptop, stood up, and stepped into the aisle. Excuse me, I said to the flight attendant who was closest to me. I'm a child psychologist. Would it be helpful if I spoke with him? The relief that flooded across the flight attendant's face was immediate and unmistakable. Oh my goodness, yes please. We're not sure what to do, and his mother is getting more upset by the minute. I made my way toward the distressed family, conscious of the fact that multiple rows of passengers were now watching this drama unfold. I could feel their eyes on me as I moved forward, and I was acutely aware that I was about to put my professional competence on display in front of the very people who had been questioning my right to be there. When I reached the boys' row, I knelt down in the aisle so that I could be at his eye level. This positioning is crucial when working with children in crisis. It makes you less threatening and more approachable, and it communicates respect for their perspective. Hi there, I said softly, using the calm, gentle tone I'd perfected over years of working with frightened children. My name is Dr. Maya. I work with kids who sometimes feel scared or worried, and I think I might be able to help you feel better. Can you tell me your name? Through his tears and rapid breathing, he managed to whisper, Tommy. Tommy, that's such a strong name. I like it, I said, maintaining steady eye contact with him. Tommy, I want you to look right at me and breathe with me, okay? We're going to take some slow, deep breaths together, and I'm going to teach you a special trick that helps when your body feels scared. I began demonstrating the breathing technique I used with anxious children. In for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, out for 6 counts. It's a simple but effective way to activate the parasympathetic nervous system and reduce the physiological symptoms of panic. Can you breathe with me, Tommy? In through your nose, nice and slow. That's it, you're doing great. Now hold it for just a few seconds, and now out through your mouth like you're blowing out birthday candles. Over the next 20 minutes, I employed every technique I'd learned and refined during my years of practice. We did breathing exercises and grounding techniques where Tommy had to identify 5 things he could see, 4 things he could touch, 3 things he could hear, 2 things he could smell, and 1 thing he could taste. I taught him a simple visualization where he imagined his worry as a balloon that he could let float away into the sky. We talked about flying and how airplanes work, turning his fear into curiosity about the mechanics of flight. I explained how the sounds he was hearing were completely normal and how the pilots were specially trained to keep everyone safe. I helped him understand that sometimes our bodies have big feelings that can feel scary, but that doesn't mean we're in any real danger. Gradually, incrementally, Tommy's panic began to subside. His breathing slowed and deepened. The flush left his cheeks. His grip on his mother's hand relaxed. The wild look of terror in his eyes was replaced by the natural curiosity of a bright 6-year-old. Dr. Maya, he said as his breathing returned to normal, do you really work with kids like me? I do, Tommy. I work with lots of kids who have big feelings sometimes. And you know what I've learned? Kids like you are some of the bravest, strongest people I know because you're learning how to handle feelings that even grown-ups sometimes have trouble with. His mother, who had been crying with relief throughout this entire process, turned to me with tears streaming down her face. I don't know how to thank you, she said. I've never seen him like that before. I was so scared. I didn't know what to do. You did exactly what you should have done, I assured her. You stayed calm, you tried to comfort him, and you asked for help when you needed it. Those are all the right instincts. Sometimes kids have panic attacks, especially in new or stressful situations like flying. It doesn't mean anything is wrong with Tommy or with your parenting. I spent a few more minutes talking with both Tommy and his mother, giving her some strategies for helping him if something like this happened again, and providing her with information about child anxiety and when it might be helpful to seek professional support. As I prepared to return to my seat, Tommy grabbed my hand. Thank you for helping me not be scared anymore, Dr. Maya. You're very welcome, Tommy. Remember what we practiced, okay? And remember that you're braver than you know. As I walked back toward my seat, something profound had shifted in the cabin. The atmosphere felt different somehow, charged with a new kind of energy. Passengers who had been watching the crisis unfold were now looking at me with expressions I hadn't seen before. Respect, gratitude, recognition. But the most dramatic change was in the woman who had questioned my right to sit in that seat less than 2 hours earlier. When I reached my row and prepared to sit back down, the woman immediately turned to face me. Her entire demeanor had changed. The suspicious, judgmental expression she'd worn since boarding had been replaced by something I hadn't expected to see. genuine remorse and what appeared to be deep shame. I I owe you a profound apology, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong and utterly inexcusable, and I'm deeply ashamed of my behavior. I settled back into my seat, studying her face carefully. This felt different from the polite but hollow apologies people sometimes offered when they realized they'd misjudged someone. There was something raw and genuine in her expression, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Thank you for saying that, I replied carefully. It takes courage to acknowledge when we've made assumptions about other people. Are you really a doctor? She asked, and I could hear in her voice that this wasn't another challenge to my credentials, but genuine curiosity mixed with regret. I'm a licensed child psychologist. I have a practice in Denver where I work with children and families dealing with various emotional and behavioral challenges. I was heading to Seattle for a conference on childhood trauma where I'm presenting some of my research. She was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information. Then she said something that surprised me. My daughter Emma is struggling with anxiety. She's 8 years old and she's been having a really hard time at school. She started having what I think might be panic attacks, similar to what that little boy just experienced. I've been thinking about finding someone to help her, but I wasn't sure where to start or what kind of professional to look for. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I could have predicted when I first boarded that plane. We spent the remainder of the flight talking about child anxiety, about the importance of early intervention, about how therapy could help children build emotional resilience and develop healthy coping strategies. I found myself genuinely moved by her vulnerability as she described her daughter's struggles. Emma had been a confident, outgoing child until about 6 months ago, when she started having difficulty sleeping, complaining of stomachaches before school, and expressing fears about things that had never bothered her before. I keep wondering if I've done something wrong as a mother, she confided. Emma used to be so fearless and now she seems afraid of everything. Last week she had what I think was a panic attack during her piano lesson, and I felt so helpless watching her struggle like that. I shared information about childhood anxiety disorders, explaining how common they were and how treatable they could be with the right support. I talked about the importance of validating children's feelings while also helping them develop tools for managing overwhelming emotions. Anxiety in children often presents differently than it does in adults, I explained. Physical symptoms like stomachaches and headaches are very common, and children often can't articulate what they're feeling emotionally. It sounds like you're being a very attentive parent by noticing these changes in Emma's behavior. I gave her my business card and provided referrals for several excellent child psychologists in her area. I also recommended some books and resources that might help her understand and support Emma while they were looking for professional help. Dr. Johnson, she said as we began our descent into Seattle, I want you to know what happened today. My behavior at the beginning of this flight, it's not who I want to be. You showed such grace in how you handled my ignorance, and then watching you help that little boy, you made me realize how much I still have to learn about judging people. She paused, seeming to struggle with her words. I realize now that I made assumptions about you based on your race. There's no other way to say it. I saw a black woman sitting in what I considered my section of the plane, and I immediately assumed you didn't belong there. I'm horrified by my own behavior, and I'm grateful that you responded to my prejudice with such dignity. Her honesty was both refreshing and challenging. It's rare for someone to acknowledge their racial bias so directly, and I found myself grappling with how to respond. On one hand, I appreciated her willingness to confront her own prejudices. On the other hand, the burden of educating others about the impact of their bias shouldn't fall on the people who experience that bias. I appreciate your honesty, I said finally. It's not easy to look at our own assumptions and biases, but it's necessary if we want to grow as human beings. Can I ask you something? She said hesitantly. How do you handle it? How do you respond with such grace when people treat you the way I treated you today? Because I imagine this wasn't the first time something like this has happened. It was a thoughtful question, one that got to the heart of what it means to navigate the world as a person of color in America. I considered how to answer honestly without making her feel even worse about her behavior. You're right that this wasn't the first time, I said. Unfortunately, experiences like this are fairly common for people who look like me. Over the years, I've learned that I have a choice in how I respond to other people's assumptions and biases. I told her about my grandmother's wisdom, about the importance of maintaining your dignity regardless of how others treat you. I talked about how responding with grace doesn't mean accepting disrespectful treatment, but it does mean choosing not to let other people's limitations limit your own humanity. I've also learned, I continued, That people's assumptions about me say much more about them than they do about me. Your initial reaction to my presence wasn't really about me at all, it was about ideas you'd absorbed about who belongs where and what different types of people are capable of. She nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right. I realized as I watched you work with that little boy that my assumptions weren't just wrong, they were preventing me from seeing who you really are as a person. We talked about how bias operates, often below the level of conscious awareness, and how it can be challenged through exposure to counter-stereotypical examples. I shared some of the research I'd studied about implicit bias and how it affects everything from hiring decisions to healthcare outcomes. The thing is, I explained, most people who harbor these biases don't think of themselves as prejudiced. They're often good people who care about fairness and equality in the abstract, but who haven't examined their own unconscious assumptions. That's exactly right, she said. I've always thought of myself as someone who believes in equality and treats everyone fairly. But clearly, I have work to do on examining my own unconscious biases. As our plane began its final approach to Seattle, I found myself reflecting on the complexity of this interaction. Here was someone who had started the flight by questioning my right to occupy the same space she occupied, and who was ending it by asking for advice about her daughter's mental health and acknowledging her own need to grow. It struck me that this was perhaps the most powerful aspect of what had happened. Not just that I had been able to help a child in crisis, but that I had been able to challenge someone's assumptions in a way that opened rather than closed their mind. This experience reminded me of why I chose to work in child psychology in the first place. Children are naturally curious and open to new experiences and perspectives. They haven't yet developed the rigid assumptions and biases that can calcify in adulthood. When I work with young clients, I'm not just helping them with their immediate emotional needs. I'm hopefully helping them develop the emotional intelligence and empathy that will make them more open, compassionate adults. But adults can change too, as this flight has demonstrated. The woman sitting beside me had been confronted with evidence that challenged her assumptions, and she had been willing to examine and adjust her worldview accordingly. It gave me hope that the broader conversations our society needs to have about race and bias aren't futile. I thought about all the other passengers on that plane who had witnessed what happened. They had seen someone make assumptions about me, and they had also seen those assumptions proven wrong in a very public way. Perhaps some of them would think more carefully about their own biases in the future. I also thought about Tommy and what he might remember about this experience. Hopefully he would remember not just that he had learned to manage his anxiety, but that a black woman had been the person who helped him feel safe and calm. Perhaps that memory would shape his assumptions about people who look like me in positive ways throughout his life. These ripple effects of individual interactions are part of what gives me hope about the possibility of social change. We can't control the biases and assumptions that people bring to their interactions with us, but we can influence how those interactions unfold and what people take away from them. Dr. Johnson, the woman said as we prepared to disembark, I hope it's okay for me to say this, but meeting you today has been a gift. Not just because you helped that little boy, but because you helped me see something about myself that I needed to see. I hope Emma gets the help she needs, I replied sincerely. And I hope your family is able to work through this challenging time together. Thank you. And thank you for responding to my ignorance with such patience and grace. I'll never forget the lesson you taught me today. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave the plane, I reflected on the remarkable journey that flight had taken. Not just the physical journey from Denver to Seattle, but the emotional and psychological journey we had all experienced together. When I had boarded that plane, I was just another passenger trying to get to a professional conference. I had been prepared for the possibility of encountering bias or discrimination. It's an unfortunate reality of traveling while black in America. But I had also been focused on my presentation and the learning opportunities that awaited me in Seattle. What I hadn't expected was to find myself in a situation where I could demonstrate my professional competence in such a public and meaningful way. The crisis with Tommy had created an opportunity for me to show, rather than just tell, who I was and what I was capable of. More importantly, it had created an opportunity for genuine human connection and understanding to emerge from what had started as a painful encounter with prejudice. This is the reality of racial bias in America that many people don't fully understand. It's often not malicious in intent, but it's harmful in impact nonetheless. It's assumptions made in split seconds, judgments based on appearances rather than character, and the exhausting reality that people like me constantly have to prove our worth and earn respect that others receive automatically. But here's what I've learned in my 34 years on this earth, and what I try to teach the children and families I work with: our dignity doesn't depend on other people's recognition of it. Our worth isn't diminished by their assumptions about us. And sometimes, the most powerful response to prejudice is simply living our truth with grace and letting our actions speak louder than their preconceptions. That flight taught me that change is possible. Not just in systems and institutions, though that's certainly necessary, but in individual hearts and minds. It happens one conversation at a time, one moment of genuine human connection at a time, one opportunity to challenge assumptions at a time. When people judge me by my skin color, they miss so much of who I really am. They miss the strength of my education, the depth of my compassion, and the power of my purpose. They miss the years I've spent learning how to heal trauma, how to build bridges between parents and children, how to help families find their way through their darkest moments. But that's their loss, not mine. I landed in Seattle that day with the same professional credentials I'd had when I boarded in Denver, but with a renewed understanding of something my grandmother had always known. Dignity isn't something you wear on the outside for others to see. It's something you carry on the inside, and no amount of prejudice can touch it unless you allow it to. The conference was wonderful. 3 days of learning, networking, and sharing strategies for helping children heal and grow. My presentation was well received, and I had productive conversations with colleagues from around the country about improving mental health services for diverse populations. But the most important learning didn't come from any workshop or keynote presentation. It came from 30,000 feet above the ground, in the space between assumption and truth, between prejudice and understanding, between reaction and response. When I returned to my practice in Denver the following week, I found myself thinking about that flight as I worked with my young clients. I thought about it when I met with Marcus, the 7-year-old who had been struggling with bullying at school. I thought about it when I worked with Aaliyah, who had been dealing with discrimination because of her accent. I thought about it when I helped David navigate the social challenges that came with his learning differences. I told these children about dignity, about the difference between other people's opinions and their own inherent worth. I told them that responding with grace doesn't mean accepting disrespectful treatment, but it does mean choosing not to let other people's limitations limit their own potential for growth and happiness. And sometimes, when they were old enough to understand the concept, I told them about a flight where someone questioned my right to occupy a seat, and how I chose to respond by occupying that space with dignity, competence, and grace. Because that's how change happens. Not through anger or retaliation, though righteous anger certainly has its place in movements for justice, but through the quiet, persistent demonstration of our full humanity, one interaction at a time. At the end of the day, they judged me by my appearance. I showed them the content of my character. And in that showing, something shifted, not just for that one woman but for everyone on that plane who witnessed what unfolded. That's the power we have as human beings, to respond to others' limitations with our own limitless capacity for grace, wisdom, and growth. It's the power to turn moments of prejudice into opportunities for education, moments of bias into chances for connection, moments of assumption into possibilities for understanding. And that power, that dignity, that strength, it flies higher than any airplane ever could. It soars above the clouds of ignorance and prejudice, carrying with it the possibility of a world where people are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character and the compassion in their hearts. Today, whenever I face moments of bias or discrimination, I remember that flight. I remember Tommy's grateful smile, his mother's tears of relief, and the genuine remorse and growth I witnessed in someone who had initially seen me as unworthy of sharing her space. I remember that change is possible, that dignity is unassailable when it comes from within, and that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is simply being exactly who you are with grace, competence, and unwavering self-respect. That lesson, learned at 30,000 feet above the American landscape, continues to guide my work, my relationships, and my approach to navigating a world that doesn't always recognize the worth and dignity of people who look like me. But their recognition, while welcome, has never been necessary for my worth. And in that knowledge there is freedom, power, and an unshakable sense of who I am and what I bring to this world.